the Black Screen History Channel, the place where history drifts softly through your ears as you slip slowly into sleep. Tonight, we're heading back to a time wrapped in mystery and fog, where the air was thick with incense, the streets were paved with mud, and life moved at a much, much slower pace. The Middle Ages. Now, when most people think of the medieval period, they imagine sickness, superstition, and stone castles shrouded in shadow. It's often painted as a dark and miserable time, cold, unwashed, and full of plague. But the truth is a little more peculiar than that, because beneath all the hardship and gloom, people still laughed. They still followed trends. And believe it or not, the Middle Ages had their own version of going viral. From pigs being put on trial, to nobles plucking out their eyebrows, strange ideas and customs swept across villages, kingdoms, and empires, catching on like wildfire in a world lit only by candlelight. Every age judges the past, but the medieval world, full of odd rituals, forgotten fashions, and wonderfully weird traditions, invites us to take a closer look. And tonight, we will. So settle in. Let the noise of the modern world fade, and together, we'll gently explore the strange and sleepy side of the Middle Ages, where even the oddest ideas had their moment in the torchlight. Let's begin. Animal Court. Let's drift now a little deeper into the strange, dreamy fog of the medieval mind. We're still in the Middle Ages, a world lit by candlelight, ruled by superstition, and moved by rituals we can barely imagine today. And in this world, justice was not reserved for humans. No, even animals could be accused of breaking the law. In fact, they often were. Imagine a quiet village square in the 14th century. There's a crowd gathered, murmuring, curious, cloaked in wool. On a raised wooden platform stands a pig. But this is no ordinary pig. It's dressed in human clothes, a waistcoat, a pair of gloves, perhaps even trousers stitched hastily from old linen. And over its face, a crude mask meant to mimic a man. It is on trial for murder. This isn't fiction. This is history. At least 85 trials involving animals were recorded during the Middle Ages. Most were deadly serious, handled with solemnity and legal formality. Witnesses were called. Evidence was considered, and punishments were carried out. Pigs were by far the most common offenders. In many cases, they had been accused of attacking children, some even eating them. The court's solution: to treat the pig like a person, a criminal, a wrongdoer before God and man. Execution was often the sentence. Hanging was typical. Sometimes, more dramatically, they were burned at the stake. It sounds surreal, and yet, to the people of the time, it made a kind of spiritual sense. The world was ruled by divine order. Everything had a soul, a place, a purpose. And if a creature broke that order, well, then the courts of earth would answer for it. But pigs weren't the only animals hauled into court. In 1474, in the Swiss city of Basel, a rooster stood trial. His crime: laying an egg, an act considered not only unnatural, but suspicious, perhaps even demonic. After all, an egg laid by a rooster could be a sign of witchcraft. It was feared that such an egg, if stolen by a sorcerer, could hatch into a basilisk, a legendary beast that could kill with a glance. And so the rooster was found guilty and burned. Sometimes the accused were not even present. Take the case of the rats. In various parts of France, rats were accused of destroying grain stores. When captured, they fled before judgment could be passed. So the court sent them letters, stern, formal warnings demanding that they vacate the premises or face spiritual consequences. Of course, the rats did not reply, but the ritual of justice had been fulfilled. And then there were dolphins. Yes, in the coastal city of Marseille, in 1596, the waters themselves were brought under legal scrutiny. A pod of dolphins had reportedly been causing trouble. And so, in an extraordinary moment of medieval logic, the sea creatures were summoned to court. The details of the dolphin trial have been lost to time, but its very occurrence paints a vivid picture. A society so devoted to law and order, so wrapped in its own cosmic understanding of right and wrong, that even the creatures of the deep were not beyond the reach of human justice. Not every story ended in flames and rope, though. In one small French town, a donkey was involved in an indecent case. A man had committed acts of cruelty against her, and though she was brought to trial, the townspeople came to her defense. A prior from a nearby convent submitted a written testimony, vouching for her character. She was, he said, virtuous, modest, gentle. She was found innocent, and so she was spared. These trials, strange as they sound, reveal something deeper about medieval life, the way people searched for structure in chaos. In a world of plagues and storms, of failed crops and sudden death, even justice for animals gave the illusion of control. A sense that someone or something was in charge. And now, as you drift, eyes heavy, breath slowing, imagine that medieval village again. The fog settling over the fields, the low bell of the church tower ringing through the dusk. In the distance, someone is reading a summons to a rooster. A donkey blinks, soft and slow, as her defenders speak kindly in her name. And a pig in a waistcoat waits silently on the scaffold, beneath a sky slowly turning violet. History is strange, but in its strangeness, we find the calm, quiet rhythm of a world very different from our own. Shotgun weddings. We come to another custom that might seem shocking to our modern minds. But in the medieval world, it was just another part of life. Marriage. Today, it's wrapped in ceremony, tradition, rings, and flowers. Vows whispered before friends and family. Perhaps a slow dance, perhaps cake. But in the Middle Ages, marriage wasn't about love. Not usually. It was a transaction, a strategy. a way to secure power, to trade land, to form alliances between noble families, lords, even entire kingdoms. Children, yes, children, were often considered ready to wed as soon as they reached puberty. Girls as young as 12, boys at 14. Consent was a formality, not an expectation. The families decided. The match was made. But here, where it becomes truly strange, there was no need for a grand church or gathering. No bouquet or music, not even witnesses. A couple could become married simply by saying the words, "I take you as my husband. I take you as my wife." And that was that. A wedding might happen in a marketplace, on a village road, in a tavern, or quite often in bed. This casual, fleeting form of union caused confusion, especially among the nobility. Who was married to whom? When had it happened? Was it valid? So, in the 12th century, the church intervened. Marriage was declared a holy sacrament, a sacred promise made not just to each other, but to God. But even then, privacy was not the rule, because a marriage wasn't truly a marriage until it had been consummated. And in medieval custom, that moment, the joining of two bodies was not hidden. It was witnessed, sometimes by family, sometimes by noblemen or servants. It was not an intimate act, but a public proof. Picture a candle-lit bedchamber in a stone manor, the walls echoing with quiet whispers. The bride, pale and nervous, is carried to the bed by her own relatives. The groom follows. Around them, a small crowd lingers, perhaps sipping warm wine, perhaps speaking softly, waiting patiently for the moment to be completed. In some cases, a curtain provided modesty, a thin veil between the couple and the watchers beyond, but not always. And when the deed was done, or thought to be, there might even be a cheer, a toast, or a quiet nod of approval. To us, this may sound bizarre, even invasive, but to them, it was simply a seal, the final lock on a social agreement that shaped entire lifetimes. And so, as you settle deeper into sleep, imagine that room, the stone walls heavy with winter chill, the scent of beeswax and old wood, the flicker of firelight on the drapes. Outside, the wind shifts through the trees, and inside, a marriage is being made not with a kiss, but with ceremony of flesh and expectation. These were the rhythms of the medieval world. Unfamiliar, uncomfortable, yet deeply human. Now let's continue on softly into more of history's strangest moments. Courtly love. Let's stay now in the world of medieval relationships, but shift away from the formality of marriage and step quietly into something a little softer, something imagined, whispered, hidden behind silk sleeves and subtle glances. Let's talk about courtly love. You see, while noble marriages were usually cold arrangements, brokered over contracts and dowries, sealed in front of stern-faced clergy, the human heart was never quite so obedient. And so, a new tradition emerged among the noble courts, tradition not of duty, but of desire. It was called courtly love. This was a ritual of romance, played out not between husbands and wives, but between nobles, often married to others, who sought connection in a more delicate, more poetic form. It was love as a game, a performance, a sweet escape from the heavy chains of arranged marriage. A lady might receive a poem from a knight. He might compose verses comparing her to the moon, the stars, a rose in bloom. She might smile, glance downward, or gently brush her hand against his in a crowded hall. A dance, a laugh, a passing touch, each gesture was loaded with meaning. It was thrilling, and yet no one was supposed to act on it. Courtly love was famously chaste, passionate, but not physical. The heart could wander, yes, but the body must stay loyal to one's spouse. That was the rule. In fact, the rules of courtly love were written down in actual lists. One stated clearly, marriage is no real excuse for not loving. Another declared, he who is not jealous cannot love. These strange commandments guided the dreamy, sometimes theatrical, dance of noble affection. It was a world of longing, beautiful, bittersweet, and often never fulfilled. Imagine a candlelit banquet, the clinking of goblets, a harp playing softly in the corner. Across the hall, two nobles lock eyes. They smile, just barely, a glance that says everything, and yet nothing. That was courtly love. It offered the emotional spark that arranged marriages so often lacked. A little drama, a little poetry, a way to keep the soul warm on long winter nights in stone castles. And so, as you drift, let yourself imagine those quiet, tender moments. A whispered compliment beneath a tapestry, a stolen glance during a slow dance, a letter folded inside a glove. In the medieval world, love didn't always belong in marriage, but it still found a way to bloom carefully, secretly, like a flower hidden in the shadow of a wall. Let's breathe here, in this secret garden of old emotions. Then, when you're ready, we'll gently move on to the next odd tale from a world long gone. Divorce by combat. Now, as our journey through the Middle Ages continues, we come to something a little more dramatic. Not a feast, not a dance, not even a trial, but a fight between husband and wife. You see, in medieval Germany, marriage disputes weren't always settled with stern talks or long silences at the dinner table. No, some couples had an entirely different solution. They went to combat. Yes, divorce by combat was a real, legally recognized way to resolve marital disagreements. When a couple had reached their limit, when words no longer worked and peace could not be found, the court offered one last option, a fight to the finish. But this was no ordinary duel. The rules were carefully designed to be, well, fair, or at least balanced. The man, often larger and stronger, was placed in a pit, a hole in the ground, chest deep, his movement restricted. One hand was tied behind his back. He was given a short stick, or sometimes nothing at all. And the woman, she remained above, free to move, circling the pit. In her hands, she held a cloth sack filled with rocks. That was her weapon. Picture it now. A quiet field on the edge of a German village. A wooden fence surrounds a small dirt arena. The man, sweating and red-faced, stands awkwardly in a hole, one hand behind him, trying to duck and dodge. His wife, sleeves rolled up, circles him slowly, swinging her sack of stones with practiced aim. There is no crowd cheering, just the faint wind in the trees and the soft thud of rock against bone. It may sound absurd, but to the people of the time, it was justice. A chance for both parties to prove, quite literally, the strength of their argument. If the man won, he was cleared. If the woman won, she had the right to leave him, or worse. These weren't common, but they happened. And records of such fights, with all their strange, symbolic rules, survive even today. It's an eerie image. A marriage reduced to mud, to bruises, to a duel in the fatting light. And yet, it tells us something, that even in the chaos of medieval law, there was a hunger for fairness, a desperate attempt to balance the scales, even in the most unbalanced of relationships. So now, as your eyelids grow heavier, imagine that quiet little battlefield, a ring of villagers watching in silence, the low clouds drifting overhead, the soft smack of cloth on shoulder, and the strange, ancient belief that love, once broken, might still be settled with one final swing. Let that strange image fade into the fog, and we'll move on, slowly, to the next curious page in the story of the Middle Ages. Hairless faces. Let's pause for a moment at the mirror. Not your mirror, of course, but one set upon the carved oak vanity of a medieval noblewoman, perhaps in a stone tower room, bathed in pale morning light. She leans in slowly, examines her reflection, and begins to remove her eyebrows. Yes, while today we lift, tint, and darken lashes and brows to frame the eyes, the beauty standards of the Middle Ages looked elsewhere. According to the ideals of the time, the most important part of a woman's face was her forehead. The bigger, the better. A tall, broad, shining forehead was a sign of intelligence, of elegance, of noble refinement. So, naturally, women did what they could to highlight it. They removed distractions, eyelashes, eyebrows, even the hairline itself. Some would pluck the hair from the tops of their foreheads, strand by strand, until their hairline was pushed back into a soft, high arc. The result, a smooth, oval face, bald and gleaming from brow to crown. It was the fashion, and like all fashions, it came with its rituals. Small tweezers made of bronze or bone, herbal creams to ease the sting, mirrors held by handmaids as noblewomen shaped their faces into the ideal. To us, it might seem strange. bare alien, almost ghost-like. But to them, it was beauty. Imagine walking through a royal court in the 14th century. The stone floors echo with footsteps. The air smells of rosewater and beeswax. And the women, dressed in rich velvet and silk, move with quiet grace, their faces pale, round, and eerily hairless. No lashes to flutter, no brows to furrow, just smooth skin rising up to an endless forehead. They would glance at you, perhaps, with distant curiosity, their blank expressions framed not by brows or lashes, but by the stillness of porcelain skin, and perhaps they believed they were closer to perfection, closer to God, because beauty in the medieval world wasn't about attraction. It was about symbolism. A pure face without earthly features was serene, angelic, untouched by the distractions of the flesh. So now, as your thoughts begin to blur and your breath slows, imagine that distant world, the flicker of a candle, the soft whisper of silk, a noblewoman alone, plucking one last strand from her brow, watching it fall into the basin like a tiny feather, preparing herself for court, or for prayer, or for nothing at all. And as that image fades, we'll drift on, quietly, to the next curious chapter in the odd, enchanting world of medieval life. A beautiful death, a moment that comes for everyone. And in the Middle Ages, one that was prepared for with great care. Death. To us, death often arrives suddenly, unexpectedly, or at least unwelcome. But in the medieval world, it was a constant companion, a familiar presence. It lingered in doorways, on the breath of a stranger, in the shadow of every cough, with plagues sweeping through villages, or ever nearby, and medicine still in its infancy. Death came often and quickly, and so people began to think deeply about how to die. Not just when or why, but how. This gave rise to a movement, a belief system, and in some ways, a trend. It was called Ars Moriendi, the art of dying. It was a guide, both written and spoken, for how to die well. Not with fear or denial or panic, but with peace, with grace, like a good Christian, like Christ himself. The dying were expected to meet their final hour with serenity. No anger, no despair, no greed, pride, or impatience, just quiet acceptance, as though the soul was gently placing itself into God's hands. Books were written, full of prayers and instructions. Paintings were made, showing saints and monks dying with calm expressions, even as they were beaten, stabbed, or burned. Imagine a small monastery tucked between hills, its windows fogged with morning frost. A monk lies on a straw mattress, his eyes closed, his lips murmuring the Lord's Prayer. Outside, the wind hums through the trees. Inside, the candles burn low. He does not cry out. He does not curse the pain. He simply surrenders. That was the ideal. A beautiful death. A death with dignity. A death that meant something. Even the average person, a farmer, a baker, A stonemason would, if possible, prepare in the same way. Confess sins, forgive debts, say goodbye to loved ones. Then lie still, hands folded, and wait. It was a performance, a ritual, a final offering of the self to something higher. Of course, not every death was peaceful. The plague was cruel. War was messier still. But the goal, the dream, the aspiration was always the same: to leave this world the way you wished to enter the next, with your heart clean, your soul calm, and your faith intact. So now, as you lay still, quiet beneath the covers, imagine the gentle hush of a medieval deathbed, the soft rustle of robes, the flicker of candlelight dancing on old stone walls, a final breath, and then stillness. Not cold, not frightening, just quiet, just release. Let that image rest with you now. And as we move on, slowly into the next story from the sleeping past, let's remember that even in a world full of hardship, the end was treated with softness, with meaning, and with grace. Soccer without rules. Let's turn to a more energetic subject, though you may want to keep lying down for this one, because tonight we're stepping into the muddy fields of medieval England, where a sport was played not with rules and referees, but with shouting crowds, flailing limbs, and the occasional broken rib. You might think sports hooliganism is something modern, something reserved for stadiums and Sunday afternoons. But long before jerseys and television broadcasts, before goalkeepers and corner kicks, the people of medieval England were already caught up in the chaos of competitive games. They just hadn't given the sport a proper name yet. What we now call football or soccer was once something much wilder. A thundering, sprawling, often brutal activity known simply as the game. There were no uniforms, no sidelines, no clear number of players. The entire village could join in, and often did. Picture a ball, usually a stitched-up pig bladder, being thrown into the street, and then dozens, sometimes hundreds of people, all chasing after it. The goal, well, that depended on the town. Sometimes it was a gate, sometimes a tree, sometimes just somewhere over the river. And how you got it there, any way you could. One rule book, if we can call it that, stated clearly that all methods of advancing the ball were allowed, except murder. Everything else, fair game. People kicked, shoved, tackled, rolled in the mud. They chased each other through barns, over walls, into streams. The ball was rarely the focus. In truth, it was often the other players getting kicked. Villages would compete against neighboring villages. Fights would break out. Bones were broken. Property destroyed. And occasionally, someone didn't walk away at all. It became such a problem that, in the year 1314, King Edward II issued a royal decree. He had had enough. He banned the game altogether, declaring that, on pain of imprisonment, such games be used in the city no more. It seems the king preferred peace. Or maybe he just preferred quieter hobbies, like falconry or chess, or something that didn't involve hundreds of muddy peasants charging down the street with war cries and flying elbows. Still, the game lived on, because it wasn't just sport. It was release. It was tradition. It was, in some strange way, joy. So now, as you lay comfortably still, imagine that distant village, a chill wind blowing through the thatched rooftops, a crowd gathering near the church square, the sound of a horn, a cheer, and then chaos, boots stomping over cobblestones, laughter, shouting, the thud of bodies tumbling into barrels, the ball, or perhaps a boot, sailing through the air, and beyond it all the rhythm of life in the Middle Ages, loud, messy, utterly human. Let the sounds fade now into the quiet hum of sleep, and we'll wander onward into more forgotten corners of a world gone strange with time, unicorns, and Jesus, as we continue our slow journey through the Middle Ages. Let's leave behind the muddy fields and wander somewhere a little more magical. Let's drift into a world of shimmering creatures, golden manuscripts, and holy visions, where mythology and religion intertwine in the most curious of ways. Because if there was one thing medieval people loved, it was stories. And if there were two things they loved, it was stories and scripture. And sometimes those two things blended together, like the tale of Jesus and the unicorn. Yes, you heard that right. Thanks to a mistranslation, one small slip of ancient language, a passage in the Bible that most likely referred to an ox, was, over time, read instead as referring to a unicorn. And in the minds of the medieval faithful, that was that. Jesus was like a unicorn, and once the idea took hold, there was no stopping it. The unicorn began to appear in paintings and tapestries across Europe, not as a creature of fantasy, but as a sacred symbol, white, graceful, untouchable, divine. Now, in medieval belief, only one kind of person could tame a unicorn, an innocent maiden. The creature would lay its head in her lap, docile, peaceful, pure. And so, in the twisting, deeply symbolic logic of the time, the unicorn became a symbol for Christ, and the maiden became a symbol for Mary. It was an allegory, strange and deeply spiritual. The unicorn, the wild and holy creature, choosing to enter the maiden's presence, became a metaphor for Christ entering the Virgin's womb. Beautiful, and also, depending on your mood, just a little bit uncomfortable. Still, to the people of the Middle Ages, it made perfect sense. They saw the world through layers of symbolism. A flower might mean faith. A lion might mean resurrection. A mythical creature could hold 1,000 meanings if placed correctly in a painting. So now, as your eyes grow heavier and your breath softens, picture a golden manuscript glowing beneath candlelight. A tiny, delicate unicorn is curled in the lap of a serene woman in blue robes. Angels hover nearby. vines wind through the margins of the page. A quiet, sacred hush falls over the scene, and in that small, painted moment, the mysteries of heaven are made visible. The Middle Ages didn't separate fantasy from faith. To them, wonder was a part of worship, and unicorns, as strange as it sounds, had a place at the altar. Let that odd image settle beside you, like a soft white creature in the stillness, and we'll carry on, slowly, into whatever strange truth history whispers next. Jesters, let us pause to meet one of its most peculiar and fascinating figures. The jester. To us today, the jester might seem like a mere clown, a simple entertainer decked out in bright colors and a floppy hat, bells tinkling with every step. A figure to laugh at, but not to be taken seriously. But in the courts of kings and nobles during the Middle Ages, jesters were far more than that. Their hats, with 3 points often shaped like donkey ears, or sometimes tiny bells, were indeed a symbol of their foolish role. Yet, this very costume granted them something extraordinary: freedom of speech. In a time when saying the wrong thing could lead to exile, imprisonment, or even death, jesters held a unique privilege. What they said was always considered just a joke, and therefore safe. This strange protection allowed jesters to speak truths that others could not even whisper. They could mock powerful lords, tease the queen, or critique the king himself, all under the guise of humor. In fact, jesters were often trusted advisors to the monarch, using wit to reveal political tensions or highlight foolish decisions. One famous example is Will Somers, the jester to King Henry VIII of England. Known for his sharp wit and quick tongue, Somers could joke about the king's temper and moods in ways no noble dared. His humor was not just entertainment. It was a way to survive, to influence, and sometimes even to steer royal decisions. Jesters often spoke in riddles and clever wordplay. Their humor could be biting, sarcastic, or playful, and their performances included storytelling, music, juggling, and acrobatics. They were masters of disguise and mimicry, able to mimic voices and mannerisms of courtiers and nobles alike, exposing hidden rivalries or hypocrisies, but always in a way that invited laughter rather than anger. And while jesters entertained the elite, they were also observers of human nature. Their role was to reflect society back to itself, a mirror held up through laughter. This power made their position delicate. A jester who offended too deeply could be dismissed, or worse. But a clever jester knew how to balance humor and honesty. In some courts, jesters even held official titles and salaries. They traveled with the royal entourage, present at feasts, councils, and ceremonies, always ready with a joke, a song, or a witty comment. Beyond Europe, jesters, or fools, had similar roles in many cultures worldwide, from the African griots, who combined storytelling and social critique, to the court jesters of the Mongol Empire. So, when you imagine the medieval court, picture a great hall of stone, long wooden tables laden with food, torches flickering against rough walls. Amid the richly dressed nobles sits a small figure, brightly colored, laughing, weaving through the crowd. He stops, bows deeply, and then, with a twinkle in his eye, speaks a sharp jest that causes laughter to ripple through the hall. And behind that laughter, a thread of truth. The jester's role was to lighten heavy hearts, to ease tension, and to speak in ways others could not. So now, as your body relaxes and your mind begins to float, let the image of the jester, with his bells and cap, his clever smile and quick tongue, linger softly. Hear the faint jingling of bells. Feel the warmth of laughter echoing softly through stone corridors, and let yourself drift gently deeper into the quiet dreams of another time. Helmeted cocks, let's turn our attention to a different kind of spectacle. One that unfolds not in the halls of power, but on the tables of the rich and noble. Medieval food. For most people of the time, the peasants and common folk, meals were simple, often repetitive, sometimes barely enough to fill empty stomachs. Coarse bread, watery pottage, and the occasional vegetables from the garden. But for the wealthy, the lords and ladies who lived in grand stone castles, the story was very different. They feasted lavishly and endlessly, as Terence Scully explains in The Art of Cookery in the Middle Ages. The rich enjoyed a vast array of meats and delicacies, some of which might seem strange, even shocking to us today. Swans, for example, graceful birds that today symbolize beauty and peace, were once a prized dish at banquets. Even more unusual, and reserved for the longest fasts of Lent, was beaver tail, eaten because, by church rules, it was considered a kind of fish. But as the noble appetite grew, cooks had to become ever more inventive, not just in flavor, but in presentation, because in the medieval world, food was about more than just taste. It was about spectacle, showmanship, a display of wealth, creativity, and power. And so, enter the curious invention known as the helmeted cock. Imagine a great hall decked with banners, lit by flickering candles and roaring fireplaces, long oak tables groan under the weight of silver platters, steaming pies, and towers of spiced fruit. At the center, a dish unlike any other, a rooster, carefully stitched and arranged, perched atop a roasted pig. It looks almost like a strange sculpture. A rooster wearing a helmet, or rather, riding the pig as if it were a noble steed. This bizarre creation was a favorite among the extravagant dishes of the medieval elite. It was the work of skilled cooks and butchers who would sew together parts of animals, creating hybrids, fusions, and curiosities to astonish and delight their guests. The helmeted cock was not just food, it was art, a conversation piece, symbol of the chef's skill and the host's wealth. The very idea of stitching a rooster to a pig might seem unsettling, but to those feasting, it was a marvel. Imagine the chef carefully assembling the parts, stitching feathers to bristles, shaping the form to perfection. The dish was then roasted to a golden brown, glistening with fat and spices, the aroma filling the great hall and teasing the guests' senses. And when it was brought in, carried proudly on a silver platter, the room would fall silent, then burst into applause or laughter. Such dishes were part of a long tradition of medieval food theater. Other creations might include pies with live birds inside, flying out in a surprise spectacle, or pies shaped like castles or ships. Food was a way to impress, to show off, and to celebrate. But behind the showmanship lay something more practical. The medieval table was a place of ritual and hierarchy. The grander the feast, the clearer the status, and dishes like the helmeted cock made that status unmistakable. So now, as you settle into quiet rest, picture the glow of candlelight on polished wooden tables, the mingling scents of roasting meats, sweet spices, and fresh herbs, the gleam of silver plates carrying fantastic creatures, part rooster, part pig, created to amaze and delight. Let that strange and wonderful image float gently in your mind, a feast for the senses, from a world both distant and strange. And as that vision fades into the soft haze of dreams, we'll quietly turn the page to the next curious chapter of the Middle Ages, the Feast of Fools. As we near the end of our journey through the curious world of the Middle Ages, let us pause at one of its most joyful and surprising celebrations, the Feast of Fools. Each year, as the cold of January settled over medieval Europe, people gathered to turn the world upside down, a day when the usual rules no longer applied, a day when the high bowed to the low, and the low rose to kingship. This festival was inspired by ancient pagan traditions like the Roman Saturnalia, but woven deeply into the Christian calendar. The Feast of Fools was a wild, raucous event. The respected officials of church and state swapped places with servants and jesters. Servants became masters, maids became lords, and the crowning moment, the election of the king of misrule, a mischievous figure who ruled the revelry with humor and chaos, though originally meant to be confined within the solemn walls of churches. The common people embraced it with their own flair. Outside the halls, streets exploded with parades, colorful costumes, bawdy songs, and comic performances. Cross-dressing was common, adding to the merry confusion. And of course, there was drinking. Plenty of drinking. It was a day to laugh, to jest, to forget the burdens of everyday life. Alongside the Feast of Fools, another peculiar celebration thrived, the Festival of the Ass. During this odd event, a young girl carrying a child would ride a donkey into the church, and the congregation would respond not with the usual amen, but with a chorus of hee-haw, mimicking the donkey's bray. Such celebrations might seem hard to imagine within the strict Christian medieval society, but they endured, a testament to the human need for joy and release. Over time, however, the authorities tightened the rules. Acts once laughed off were banned. The wild freedom of the feast was curtailed, and the Protestant Reformation delivered the final blow, condemning the excesses and ending centuries of fun. Yet, even in its decline, the Feast of Fools reminds us of a world where laughter could break the chains of hierarchy, if only for a day. So now, as your eyes grow heavy and the quiet of night surrounds you, picture the laughter echoing through frosty streets, the bright costumes swirling in the cold air, the crowned king of misrule leading a procession of joyful fools. Let that image carry you softly into dreams, a last glimpse of medieval mischief. And as you drift deeper into rest, thank you for joining me on this journey into the past. If you enjoyed wandering these strange and wonderful tales with me, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more curious stories from history's forgotten corners. Sleep well, and until next time,